It was bitterly cold on the morning of April 9th as we passed through Oldenzaal, Denkamp and Nordhorn. The River Ems was crossed at Lingen as we headed in the direction of Bremen. On the radio from home and in the newspapers, the talk was increasingly of the end of the war being in sight. But our own briefings did not encourage us to think that it was such a foregone conclusion. The Germans still had to be defeated, and the fighting at the Rhine and since showed that they would still fight for every inch of their homeland. The first opposition was met on April 11th, on the outskirts of Lonningen. Lieutenant Beddington and his crew went forward on foot to examine a roadblock, where they came under heavy fire from machine guns and Panzerfausts, killing Trooper Rudland and wounding others. Lieutenant Hunt's tank was hit by a Panzerfaust, killing Hunt and Trooper Tyler. Hunt had only just joined the regiment a week before, coming straight from Sandhurst. Men of the King's Royal Rifle Corps extracted the wounded men from the burning tanks, though Trooper Bryce died of his wounds later that day. There was further trouble the next day. C Squadron entered Lastrup without opposition, but suddenly found themselves surrounded and under fire. They rapidly tried to reverse back out, but Sergeant Budner's Firefly was hit in the turret by a Panzerfaust, killing Budner and Trooper Young. Troopers Keefe and Clough were still inside the tank trying to extinguish a fire when the Germans overran the tank trying to extract them, until Trooper McGowan in one of the other tanks gunned them down with his Sten gun. Keefe managed to escape, but Clough was taken prisoner. On Friday, April 13th, there were even more casualties at Kloppenburg. The road was frequently blocked by felled trees, and removing these was both difficult and dangerous, as the approaches were covered by enemy guns. German parachute troops were in evidence, and there was also plenty of snipers. The south side of the town was only lightly held, but resistance stiffened the further we went in. The infantry kept finding themselves held up, and the tanks of Richard Hyde's troop had an unpleasant time clearing out the offenders. 4 men were killed. First, the tank of Sergeant Sage, one of the regiment's oldest and most experienced tank commanders, took a direct hit through the turret from a Panzerfaust. Sage and Trooper Fletcher were killed. Then Troopers Hulland and Snedker were killed by machine gun fire as they tried to rescue Sage and Fletcher from the burning tank. We were therefore pleased to be allowed to rest on April 14th to the 18th. On the roads there was an increasing number of displaced persons of one kind or another. Quite a few of these were slave labourers who had been employed on German farms and were now looking to go home. Many of them were French and Belgians, and it was also obvious that the German civilians were increasingly worried about the possibility of reprisal attacks from these people. Quite a few German civilians were also on the roads, trying to escape the fighting. And not far west of us was the German concentration camp of Belsen, with all its horrors, which had been liberated on April 13th. Since our move on April 9th, my role had been to act as an extra liaison officer to Brigadier Code, along with Dennis. Code was a grand chap, and we both got along very well with him. There was nothing much for my recce troop to do, so I spent my time in the Dingo rushing up to the forward troops and back again, so that Dennis could pass on the information to the Brigadier. By now the British advance was getting close to Bremen. On April 18th we went into action again in support of the 9th Brigade for the 3rd British Division, with the view of penetrating into the southern suburbs of Bremen. That evening I went to have dinner with B Squadron, as Dennis had now returned to them, determined to see some action in command of a troop before the war ended. As I was leaving after a very convivial evening, Dennis was looking for his bedroll, which had somehow gone missing. As he loved his bed, this was something of a disaster, but I turned to him and said, "Oh, stop flapping about, it'll turn up in the morning. Now stop being so rude, and show your visitor out." He stopped his search for a moment, and came to me to say good night. "Look after yourself," I said. "Remember what I've told you, and don't do anything bloody silly." "No," he said rather humbly, "I won't. Good night, little fella." And then I left. On the next day, April 19th, it was C Squadron who started the attack, which was then taken over by A Squadron. One of the troop commanders was Peter Mellows, whose tank broke out of the bridgehead of the River Issel and headed northeast without encountering much opposition. On the outskirts of Bremen, he broke through the German outer defences, advancing with the Royal Ulster Rifles on either side of the road. Suddenly a platoon commander came running back, climbed on Peter's tank and pointed out a house on the crossroads about 400 yards ahead, where he said the Germans were dug into strong positions. Peter took his tank up to the house, which concealed him from the Germans' view, As he moved forward through a small orchard, he found that he had come round only 50 yards behind them, and they were oblivious to his presence. The Germans were dug into a road embankment with anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine guns, and their position extended for 400 yards or so. Peter ordered his tanks to fire and completely wiped out the German positions, killing scores. He climbed out of his tanks to see if there were any survivors, and were horrified to find that most of the dead were just boys of 16 or 17, whose lack of preparedness was a sign of both their inexperience and the fact that they had been badly led. Peter reported back to his squadron and was told to consolidate his position on the crossroads he had just captured. There he waited for several hours until reinforcements came up, which was at about 4:30 in the afternoon. The first troop to come up was from B Squadron, which had now taken over the advance, and this troop was commanded by Dennis Elmore. Dennis's tank had a small model aeroplane on the front, with a tiny propeller, which was turning slowly in the wind. He listened to a situation report from Peter, and then announced he had been ordered to advance further up the road, and set off. All this time I had been sitting with the elements of Regimental HQ, who were themselves at the HQ of 9th Brigade. I did not have my wireless on because my own troop had little to do, and Regimental HQ would tell me if anything was needed. After a while, however, something decided me to go up to the forward troops to find out what was happening, and I set off in my dingo with Bert Crowhurst driving. As I was racing along the road to the front, Frenchy Horton, the adjutant, stopped me and said, "I'm afraid Richard Hyde has just had it up the road. His tank is completely brewed up." My heart was now racing, and I asked for the tank's code sign. 1, Frenchy answered. I felt a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach as I struggled to digest this simple piece of information. "That's not Richard Hyde," I answered. "It's Dennis." Frenchy moved away, and I told Bert Crowhurst to go further up the road. I could not believe what I heard was possible, and I was trying desperately to cope with a whole range of emotions, and to hope against hope that there must be some mistake. I saw a tank coming back down the road towards us, and for a moment I thought it might be Dennis. On the back it had 2 or 3 wounded, whom it was taken to regimental aid post, and I flagged it down. "What happened?" I asked. "Is it Mr. Elmore's tank?" One of those in the back of the tank replied. "We were hit by an 88mm, sir, right through the turret. Mr. Elmore's had it." My stomach turned to water. "Can anyone get near the tank?" I asked. "No, sir, it's burning like hell, and all the rounds are exploding all over the place." "So there's positively no chance of him getting out then?" I asked again. But I knew, even before I spoke, what the reply was going to be, and the answer came back firmly and clearly. "None whatsoever, sir." I later found out what happened. Dennis had left Peter Mellows at the crossroads and disappeared from sight around the next corner. Peter then heard a very loud bang, which must have been the precise moment when the 88mm armour-piercing shell went straight through the turret, where Dennis would have been sitting, and the tank started to burn. Dennis would certainly have been killed instantly, which was at least some comfort, and 2 of his crew, Troopers Harkness and Miles, also died. On the next day, Padre Skinner was at last able to approach the smouldering tank and extricated the bodies of Dennis and Trooper Miles. He buried them temporarily nearby and then returned to exhume the bodies and rebury them in the 8th Infantry Brigade Cemetery at Farrenhorst. Later, Dennis's grave moved first to Soltau, which I visited, and finally to Becklingen. My own feelings as Bert Crowhurst turned the dingo round and drove back could be imagined. Even at this distance in time, the memory of that day still hurts, and I can still see Dennis's cheery face that last evening when we were together. I told Bert to drop me and to go back to the wrecking troop billets, because I just wanted to be alone. I wandered around on my own for hours, convulsed in tears. The pain and shock were too difficult to bear in any company, however well-meaning. I had already lost so many friends of all ranks, and yet had managed to hold my own and keep going. But this loss was much more difficult to cope with, because it was so unexpected and so unfairly near the end of hostilities. If only Dennis had not gone back to B Squadron, if only he had not taken the lead with his troop that afternoon, if only... Then I began to wonder why it should have been him rather than me. I had, after all, experienced many more near misses during those months Dennis had been recuperating at home. I reflected on all we had been through in the past, at Tunbridge, at Sandhurst, in the regiment, and none of it seemed to lead to this point. I knew, however, that I'd have to keep going, because others depended on me. My recce troop were wonderful, and I'd never experienced such kindness, both from them and the officers at Regimental HQ. We were by now well into Bremen, assaulting the northern suburbs despite fire from gunboats in the harbour. There was street fighting to be done in the city on April 26th and 27th, alongside 129 Brigade, and the commander of the German garrison, General Becker, was captured by a troop of B Squadron. Bremen's dock area had been completely flattened by shelling and RAF bombing. But the wealthier suburbs, which contained some lovely houses, were relatively undamaged. In several of these houses, however, whole families had committed suicide, including the Nazi mayor, his wife, and 3 children. There was only one casualty for the regiment in Bremen itself, and it was sadly an accident. A shell, jammed in an overheated barrel, exploded, killing the tank's gunner, Trooper Harris. We concentrated on April 29th to move forward to Cuxhaven further north. We marched through Bassen, Buckholes, where we met opposition in the form of a German officer who shot the track off Sergeant Webb's tank with a Panzerfaust, before he himself was mown down by the tanks behind. Then it was on to Raid and Karlshofen, where we came across several large mines in the road. On May 2nd, the regiment suffered its very last fatal casualty of the war, when Trooper Carter of A1 Echelon was killed by a sniper, along with a military policeman to whom he was showing the way. Although the last casualty of the war, there were 2 others soon later. Sergeant Weir was killed when his dingo hit a truck and crashed down a railway embankment in Germany on June 27th. And finally, Trooper Kelly died in another road accident on July 14th. Nearby, the brigade had liberated the Sandbostel concentration camp, where 2,000 out of a total of 22,000 inmates had died in the previous 10 days. Conditions there, as at Belsen, were indescribably awful. On Friday, May the 4th, the regiment crossed the Ham Canal. On the previous day, Hamburg had surrendered to the British 7th Armoured Division, so we knew that the end was near. Regimental HQ established itself at Karlshofen, in a picturesque old farmhouse, which had been spared damage. And soon after we arrived, our old friend General Thomas of 43rd Division came to tell us what would be our next operation, the capture of Bremerhaven, in support of its infantry. Thomas still remained his fire-eating self and was determined not to let up on his relentless assault on the enemy, even though that implied further casualties at this late stage. My own recce troop had little to do, and that evening on May 4th, I agreed to drive 2 of the men, in my dingo, down to the echelon so that they could go on leave. It was cold, showery, and getting dark as I came back along the road. I looked up and suddenly in the distance saw hundreds of coloured Very lights and rockets shooting into the air. The sky itself was being further illuminated by many searchlights, and it was an extraordinary sight. I turned to Bert Crowhurst beside me and said, "That's either a signal for a night attack, or peace has just been declared. Step on it, and we'll find out." We raced back to Regimental HQ where bedlam reigned. Sergeant Pick, the signals sergeant, had a message pad in front of him, and I craned my neck over his shoulder to read what was on it. I could not help but notice that Pick's face and neck were slightly flushed, and that he and everyone in there were in a state of enormous excitement. The signal had come from Brigade HQ, and it said, "No advance beyond present positions. No further harassing fire. No practical move without further orders. BBC News confirmed. German Army on 21st Army Group front surrenders with effect from 0800 hours tomorrow, 5th of May 1945. Details as to procedure will follow. That afternoon on Lumberg Heath at 6:30 p.m, General Admiral von Friedberg, the German Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, had signed the instrument of surrender of all German forces in the West to Field Marshal Montgomery, to take effect the following morning. What I had seen in the evening sky was the British Army celebrating the end of nearly 6 long years of war with the only appropriate means to hand. That celebration was to continue all through the night. On the previous day, we had been in action and started to prepare for our next attack on Bremerhaven. Now all that was behind us, and the sudden unexpectedness of the end caught me by surprise. I felt as though I'd been engulfed in a huge wave. My first reaction after the initial excitement had died down was one of indescribable relief that the killing was now over. Then came a sense of intense exhilaration as I was swept along the tide of excitement and emotion filling Regimental HQ. Everyone from the colonel downwards had broad grins and were slapping each other on the back and shaking hands, regardless of rank. Confirmation of the message arrived by dispatch rider an hour later from Brigadier Code, and then the search for drinks began. Luckily we did not have to look far, because thanks to some liberation work done by the 51st Highland Division, we had large stocks of champagne in the mess truck, which was immediately brought in by Sergeant Marshall. Corks were popped with a noise resembling gunfire, but the champagne tasted good, and we vied with each other to fire flares from the very pistols as far in the air as we could. After half an hour or so of drinking and wild excitement, the reaction set in, and I thought back to 6 years when I'd been a 15-year-old schoolboy at Tunbridge, and reflected how far I'd come since that time. I thought of my parents in their prison camp in Hong Kong, from whom I had not heard properly for so long, and wondered if they were even still alive. I thought of my brother and sister and other relatives back in England, not knowing if the news we had received had yet filtered back home. I thought of all those men with whom I had served since that fateful 6th of June, and how many of them had not been lucky enough to make it this far. In particular, I thought of Keith Douglas and Johnny Mann, Ted Cook and John Holmes, Doug Foote and Jeff Story. But the real sense of aching was for Dennis, who had shared so much of my life at Tunbridge and in the war over the last 8 years. It just seemed so unfair that he was not here to enjoy this moment, which he had done as much as anyone to deserve, but instead lay in the cold earth a few miles back along the road we had liberated. To be cut down so near the end, when he had so much life to live for, was sadness itself, and I could not get him out of my mind as the champagne lost its fizz. Quietly I put down my glass and slipped away from the celebrations to my bed. I just wanted to be alone with my thoughts and to reflect on what might have been. I awoke the next morning to find the sun streaming through the window. This was the morning, I thought, for which we had all waited and fought for so long. No more death. No more shooting. No more burning tanks or loud explosions. I could rise from my bed and go to breakfast without worrying whether I'd be blown to bits that day. Everything which had for so long held us down and ruled our lives had now been taken away in an instant. We were free and at peace. It was time for me to get on with the rest of my life.